I am so excited about our next guest. I have been listening to his interviews, reading his interviews on his book. I think it required a tremendous amount of research, really impressive work. Vincent Bevins is an author. He's a journalist. He's the author of the new book, The Jakarta Method. He has covered Southeast Asia for the Washington Post, Brazil for the LA Times, and London for the Financial Times. His work as a journalist has been recognized by the Los Angeles Press Club, the European Union's Lorenzo Natali Media Prize, and the Overseas Press Club. This is a book about Washington's anti-communist crusade and mass murder, really. So Vincent, thank you so much for joining us. We are, as you know, on the road, and you are not in the U.S. right now. Where are you, just to start off the show?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm in London. Thanks for inviting me. I was in Sao Paulo for most of this year, kind of accidentally stuck there because of the coronavirus, and now in London, which is like where I live as much as anywhere else at the moment. So
this book it required a tremendous amount of research. You ended up working in Indonesia, but you had previously worked in Brazil, and through your work in Indonesia, you uncovered these stories, personal stories, and just a history that had been kind of left out of American history, I guess you could say, from the mainland. But it intersected with your work in Brazil. Can you talk about what led you to uncover this mass murder, essentially?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I was in Brazil for 6 years as correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, reporting on sort of the collapse of the Workers' Party social democratic project that was started by Lula, and then under Dilma fell apart very catastrophically. And then I went to Southeast Asia to cover that whole region for the Washington Post. And I was based in Jakarta, looking most closely at Indonesia. And I found that sort of every story that I was doing about Indonesia or about Southeast Asia in general, right below the surface was this very violently and purposely repressed story of the intentional mass murder of approximately 1 million innocent civilians with the active support of the United States. And then
in terms of the population, I mean, 1 million is jarring,
right.
But how large is the population of Indonesia, at least at that time?
It is, at the time, it was about a little bit more than 1 million people. So now it's the fourth largest country in the world by population. At the time, it was still very big, but in places like Bali, which was the worst hit, at least 5% of the population was killed. The remains of those people that were killed are often still scattered across the island underneath tourist hotels that were explicitly set up as a result of the right-wing transfer of power that took place. So to get back to your question about the connection to Latin America, I found that there were real intersections with the stories of coups in South America that I think English speakers probably know a little bit better, in Chile and in Brazil, in Argentina. And one sort of unexplored corner of this history that I wanted to look at sort of to bring the whole book together is that this mass murder of the Indonesian Communist Party in 1965, which I argue was maybe the most important victory of the Cold War for the side that ultimately won, it was seen as such an obvious victory for Washington and for Washington's allies around the world that people took inspiration from it. So in Brazil and in Chile, you had the use of the word Jakarta to signify mass murder. So either Jakarta is coming was spray painted on the walls of leftists to indicate we're going to do to you what they did in Indonesia, we're going to kill you. Or Brazil had Operação Jakarta. In Central America, we had some indication. There were conversations about deploying the Jakarta method also, when ultimately it was hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans that were killed by far-right US-backed regimes using the threat of communism as justification.
This is in 1964, post-McCarthy era.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where was this coming from? If it was coming from, much of the strategy was coming from Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. So McCarthyism, starting right after the end of World War II, but then going into the 50s and longer, really wiped out anybody in the entire United States government that was not committed to fanatical anti-communism. But for the rest of the century, the confronting communism around the world was a bipartisan consensus. It was considered by everybody in the U.S. foreign policy establishment that communism needed to be fought, whatever that meant, however little connection there was to the Soviet Union. In the case of Indonesia, we were talking about an unarmed, moderate communist party, which sought to work with capitalist elements and then only much later pursue a peaceful transition to socialism. They were winning elections left and right. But where did this come from? This was the result of 10 years of CIA-backed or U.S. foreign policy officials attempting to crush the Indonesian left. So it might be a bit shocking to hear that it ended up in mass murder, but it was not the first thing they tried, right? So the CIA in 1955 first tried to funnel money into other parties that might sort of stop the rise of the very popular and democratically active Communist Party. And then in 1958, the CIA actually helped to bomb the country, dropping explosives all over Indonesia in the active attempt to break it up. At that point, they lost. They were exposed. An American pilot crash landed into an island, and they shifted tactics. And it was only through years of active collaboration between the U.S. military and the Indonesian military that this kind of a solution, this kind of a method could emerge. And in 1965, we still don't know, because the CIA has not declassified its activities in the early 60s, if the actual mass murder was something that emerged spontaneously after a clash was created intentionally, or if the mass murder was planned, or to what extent the actual mass murder had the United States in its sort of conception. But we absolutely know that once it started, as soon as the United States in the late months of 1965 recognized that there was an opportunity to crush the left, it was an enthusiastic supporter of the mass murder. It offered material and sort of very important international support, encouraged the murders, made it very clear to the Indonesian military that in order to get what they wanted, they had to crush the left. And everybody knew at the time that this meant to kill more leftists. And it's only as a result of decades and decades of careful work by scholars that spent a lot more time on this than I did, that we were able to see declassified files indicating just how complicit or how active the United States was in participation in this murder. And what I did is, as you said, is I spent some time popping around 12 different countries and doing interviews with survivors, people that could still remember what happened and talk about their experiences, and so that I could, as a journalist, sort of put this all into a single book that might make sense to a lay regular reader. But this history was hidden for a very long time and on purpose.
When you say that you saw some declassified files, where did they come from?
So the State Department has declassified a huge amount of files. Bradley Simpson, historian that works around DC, has been sort of the most important academic in doing this work. And then on the Indonesian side, there's activists that for decades and decades have been fighting for their right to speak out about what has happened. But it is still absolutely not safe to speak out about what happened. If those people who were victimized in 1965, who had their family members killed, had friends killed, are still often suffering as a result, and to tell the story truthfully is illegal in Indonesia. So, as I said,
because it's an essentially oppressive capitalist dictatorship.
They passed a law in 1966 banning any kind of apology for communism, and telling the truth can be portrayed as that if they want to.
So you have literally millions of families who have not received acknowledgement or justice, or are willing to talk about it, to mourn the loss of their family members. Exactly. And then you have a Western media which didn't cover it. There was
a small amount of very enthusiastic celebration in outlets like the New York Times and Time Magazine, but then it very quickly dropped off the map. Indonesia was people stopped talking about Indonesia very quickly as Vietnam became a more important thing in the United States, even though Indonesia, as I said, was a much more important victory for the U.S. foreign policy establishment than Vietnam. Everybody always recognized that Vietnam was very little compared to Indonesia. But yeah, there was celebration and then silence for a very long time on the part of sort of our mainstream corporate press.
So when you talk about the actual methods, I mean, can we describe some of these methods that have been duplicated, and what sticks around? I mean, it's hard to imagine something so vast happening today, but be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, as you point out, it's kind of chilling, but everybody that I spoke to that lived through something like this, whether it was in Indonesia or Chile or Brazil, they all told me in the years before, they thought, oh, we know that these kinds of things don't happen anymore. So in 1962 in Brazil, Brazilians thought, that's stuff from the past. They don't do that anymore. Same in Chile, same in Indonesia. So the method that is most sort of disturbingly replicated is that of disappearances. So those that know a little bit of Latin American history might know about the desaparecidos in Argentina or Brazil or Central America. In Indonesia, 1965, as I said, this was an unarmed moderate communist party. So a lot of the people that were taken in and then ultimately killed had no idea that any of this could have happened to them. So they went in voluntarily, and then in the middle of the night or while nobody was looking, they were taken away and killed and thrown into a river or disposed of.
When you say went in voluntarily, went in where?
To police stations or they were arrested, or they reported themselves to police or the military for believing that it would be just questioning or a couple days of imprisonment while they cleared all this up because they knew they hadn't done anything wrong. But then the disappearance functions, as a lot of people know, in that after they're dead, nobody is told that they're dead, which is an incredibly effective way for terrorizing family members and friends that might otherwise rebel or make a lot of noise, because it's the natural human instinct to think, well, maybe they're still alive, and if I do something, maybe that will be the thing that costs them their lives. So other historians that have worked on this believe that probably 1965 was the first time that mass disappearances was used in Asia, and then in 1966 we see the first evidence of mass disappearances being employed in Latin America. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps a very suggestive coincidence, but there were U.S. officials in the CIA and other agencies that moved from Southeast Asia to Central America in exactly that year. So you see people on the right realizing, oh, this worked. We can do it. Not only will it work, but the United States will help us and then play defense for us on the international stage, which is exactly what happened. And on the other side of the coin, in 1965, left-wing movements who were paying very close attention to the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union and China, the largest unarmed socialist party in history, they came to the conclusion that, oh, there's no peaceful road to socialism. If you try to play by the rules, they're going to kill you. And in many different ways, left-wing movements radicalized as a result of this. So as you said, we kind of forgot about this for a very long time, but at the time, it had huge effects on both right-wing tactics, which were ultimately successful in constructing, I think, the world that both you and I live in today, and in making the left take a more radical turn, believing that they must, if they wanted to survive.
They must arm, they must organize, they must actually fight back. Yes.
Yeah.
Echoing moments right now. So what kind of tactics that you read about exist today? Obviously you look at a place like Venezuela, there are some hotspots where people are still being abducted and there's still there are massacres that still exist on this planet. But let's talk about the Western world. What type of tactics are used to pressure the left, to pressure the anti-capitalist movements that are popping up all over the world right now?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think that one thing that I try to make clear in this book is that while people have a very easy time talking about communist things and the international communist conspiracy, things that all the communists did, it's often forgotten quite often that the right was really an international movement that worked across borders and that learned from victories here, failures there. And over those decades in which they ultimately racked up a lot more victories than the left did, they also created this sort of toolbox, this list of things that worked. They learned what worked. They learned what worked here. They built on that. They improved on that. And while the Soviet Union went away at the end of the 1980s, the United States and that toolbox did not. Right. So all the agencies that were responsible for doing all of this exist in more or less the same form that they did in 1988. And so my book focuses on the sort of most horrible and perhaps eye-catching of the tactics that was employed against the left in the 20th century, which is mass murder. But there was a number of others, right? As I said, there was just simply funneling money to people that oppose them. This is what happened in Indonesia. They tried to funnel money into a right-wing Muslim party. There is economic terror, which we saw employed against President Jango in Brazil right before his coup. You just dry up international capital markets, and then you make it very difficult for a regime to survive. This is something that, of course, is used now, I think, overtly and covertly. So Iran is a very good example of the use of sanctions, and it's said out loud that it's being done, and it's justified. But I think probably we'll find out in 5 to 10 years that it's being done against other regimes that we don't know about as well. And then you have all types of more direct regime change, right? So the actual military coup and invasion. As I said, what I try to lay out is this vast constellation of things tactics that worked in the 20th century. And I think anybody that reads that will probably come away thinking, okay, there's a lot of things that echo with the 21st century, and they should. I mean, we still have a world that is led by the United States as as by far the most economically and militarily predominant power.
You spent, was it 3 years collecting stories on the ground?
Yeah, I did.
How were you able to, I mean, you're a Western, you're an American, and this is a colonized land. How were you able to build those connections with folks and really get them to reveal stuff that could cost them, you know, I don't know if they break the law, does it cost them their life? Is it a fine? I'm not sure what the punishment is, but it takes a lot to be able to get on the ground and speak with folks, especially if you don't speak the language, or I know many speak English, but.
No, I did interviews in Indonesian, Spanish, Portuguese, and then only English in rare cases. But no, that's I spent a lot of time making sure that I could get the interviews, and I spent a lot of time, and I worried quite a bit that I would be doing this in a respectful way. So in order to get the interviews with Indonesians, what I did is I slowly went to all the organizations that deal with survivors, still sort of advocate for their goals now. And now that the book's over, every once in a while I try to raise some money for them on Twitter. But I introduced to them the project, who I was, and I was very honest with what I wanted to do. And it was only after they all said, yes, this is something we want to exist, that I went to the next step. But even that next step consisted of living near the survivors for weeks and then months, slowly figuring out who actually wanted to talk to me, who didn't. And anybody that didn't, I didn't press it. I figured out who really wanted to tell the whole truth and who did it. And those that really understood, okay, I know what this is. I know who Vincent is. As you say, he's an American, but maybe he's sympathetic to the story, or at least he'll be fair to me. Only then, finally, did I do the many interviews from which that I selected to make the book. But I mean, that if I didn't do that, sort of taking the real time to make those connections and make sure that I was doing it right, I probably could have done it in a year instead of 3 years. There's probably an extra 2 years of finding the people that could really bring the story together and making sure that I was doing the interviews respectfully.
When did the Jakarta method end? When did we stop fully using this method?
Yeah, I mean, I delineate it in a quite narrow way. So I talk about anti-communist mass murder from 1945 to 2000. When the Soviet Union falls, and then the last sort of example I use in this map that I draw of all these programs in the end is Colombia, which goes after the end of the official Cold War, same with Guatemala. At that point, there is no longer communism as the justification. Although we may see it come back in the United States and Brazil, it's certainly come back with who knows how the U.S. will confront China in coming years. But historians that study U.S. history from an even wider perspective that I do, link the war on terror in the beginning of the 21st century to the Cold War, and they link the Cold War to a much larger story of U.S. militarism and aggression going back to basically the colonization of North America, right? So Audun Westad, who's a really good historian, whose books I recommend, argues that this method, it takes, there's certain inflections. The enemy is officially communism from 1945 to 1990, but really this fits into a larger story of the European colonization of the global South and the United States of America as a very militaristic white settler colony that ends up taking over for Europe in a sort of informal colonial relationship, which I still think dominates. But as you say, you could see something like this come back. We certainly saw a lot of Muslim lives discarded or treated as if they were not valued because of some link to some kind of a global international terrorist conspiracy. I think you can draw a pretty straight line from that. And you could also see with Bolsonaro or who knows, arguably what's happening in Bolivia right now could be regarded as anti-left terror and on a much smaller scale, but it could escalate. So I think it ended sort of in the 2000s, but as a larger ingredient in U.S. hegemony, it's still very much with us and could come back in a big way.
I think it must have been just today. I was listening to a report of a Colombian leftist now apologizing for how they treated. I was kind of jarring, actually, just to see an acknowledgement on the left side of how they treated politicians during the war in 2004. I think it was when it was this one incident had happened. But I mean, it's it's interesting to see how they want to adapt their strategies, and they're trying to learn from the past 20 years, maybe in reference to how the left responds in this moment in Bolivia, in Brazil. I'm not sure. It's just something to think about, hearing that report. But this is such an interesting book in terms of like the moment that we're in right now. It's hard to predict these kinds of things, but what tactics do you think could potentially be used in the future, given the environment, the lessons, honestly, even social media, with all these tools at our disposal? What do you think could still be used?
Well, if you're talking about the United States, I think the thing that echoed most clearly to me in the last 6 months is the use of the intentional misinformation, which claims that the opponents of any given regime or the people on the streets are actually part of some dark international cabal. And once you claim that, that's enough to treat them as less than citizens, if not less than human, right? So that's one of the tactics that I said is in that big toolkit that works. If you look at the coups that are carried out, Iran 53, Guatemala 54, Brazil 64, Indonesia 65, Chile 73, the CIA learned very quickly, and they weren't the ones who invent this, that if you want to crush your enemy, it's very easy that you should use your position of institutional power to spread insane lies about them right before, and then now you have a justification. And then maybe people are battling those lies, but after you've won the war, now the battle is happening at the discursive level. You've already won, and now people are just challenging whether or not your justification is right, or if there's actually deeper truth. And this is a battle we've been fighting in Indonesia for 50 years, and those people never got justice, and they certainly didn't get the more just society that they were fighting for in the early 60s. So I think that in the era of social media, that kind of disinformation that is often top down and intentional is as dangerous as ever, if not more. And as I said, everyone that I ever spoke to who lost a family member or a friend believed a few years ago that kind of stuff didn't happen anymore.
The people that you spoke with, the victims, I mean, 1 million people, I'm assuming they weren't all high-level folks. I mean, how low did it go in terms of the murders and the capturing of folks?
So there were 3 million active members in the Indonesian Communist Party. 20 to 35% of the country was somehow affiliated with the Indonesian Communist Party. This was not like a secret group of guerrillas in the mountains with Che Guevara. This was like, if you were a teacher, if you worked at the post office, if you were a farmer, you were probably somehow affiliated. So depending on where you were, any kind of association or accusation of association was enough to get you killed. So of those 1 million, a lot were actually the Communist Party members, which does not mean they did anything wrong. That no one did anything wrong, except for perhaps a small group of people in Jakarta that got involved in a botched coup attempt. But then there was also people that were just, in my book, where, a lot of the characters are precisely this. Magdalena, a woman who's still sort of relying on charity to survive in central Indonesia now. She was just a teenager working at a union. She put T-shirts together. But a union membership was enough to get her to round it up and really undergo things that wouldn't are really too difficult even to talk about on, I think, a show like this. And I think people in Central America and South America recognize that pattern. Okay, well, yeah, they pulled they rounded up all the union people, they threw them in jail. They rounded up all the teachers that were even slightly suspected of being left-wing. And in Indonesia, there was a small racial element to it as well. So sometimes if you were Chinese, that was enough to get you hauled in. But often it was just if you had any kind of way that the people in power in your village wanted to smear you as a leftist, they would just do so, and that would be enough. And because of this terror that I described that is created by disappearances, nobody wanted to ever admit that had happened to their family. People that remained quiet, and it was largely successful. And it didn't matter when you look back at, by 66, 67, it didn't matter that almost a third of the country was sympathetic to the Communist Party. Nobody wanted to admit anymore they had ever had anything to do with it because they saw what could happen.
Okay, just before we wrap up, how quickly after this genocide, essentially, did capital start to come in and build? I mean,
really, really quickly, and it was all the people you would expect. It was major U.S. corporations, oil companies, all the big famous companies. They were pouring in to Jakarta for swanky business conferences in nice hotels, as another 1 million people were still being kept in concentration camps, tortured and starved, simply for their political beliefs. So all the big names are there. I describe it in the book. But through doing this, dictator Suharto, through crushing the left and taking power, and through consolidating a far-right capitalist regime, he immediately was welcomed with open arms into the community of, quote unquote, the free world, right? He was immediately given carte blanche to do what he wanted in his own country, as long as he had a good relationship with Washington's foreign policy establishment and U.S. business community. So he ended up being one of the most corrupt leaders in history. He ended up invading East Timor, killing a higher population of that country than Pol Pot killed in his own country. And the United States, as I described earlier, played defense for him on the international stage until the very end of the Cold War. And right away, oil companies and U.S. big business interests were having a great time making deals in Jakarta. I think there's a big conference in '66. I think that I describe in pretty elaborate detail.
It's that fast.
Yep.
Unbelievable, Vincent. I wish we could talk for much longer. This is a really fascinating book, fascinating work. Maybe we'll come back for round 2. Hopefully, it's a great warning for everybody. Vincent Bevins, author of The Jakarta Method. Thanks for your work. It's late over there, so I hope you get some rest in London. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.